I found my wife's earring in my best friend's truck an hour after she told me she was at her sister's house. And even now, I can still feel the exact moment my stomach dropped, because it was not just any earring. It was the small gold one I bought her on our 10th anniversary, after she cried in the kitchen and told me nobody had ever made her feel seen the way I did. I was only in Tyler's truck because he asked me to grab the charger from the center console while he ran inside the gas station, and when I saw that earring tangled beside a red lipstick cap that was not even her shade, it felt like the world tilted a few inches and never straightened back out. I remember just staring at it while my phone buzzed in my hand with her text saying, "I'm with Megan. Stop checking on me like I'm a child." And I could actually hear her voice in my head, that sharp, irritated voice she used whenever I got too close to something she did not want explained. The worst part is that an hour before that, I had still been trying to be a good husband. We had been married 11 years, together 14, and I had spent the last 6 months telling myself her distance was stress, her coldness was exhaustion, her locked phone was privacy, and the way she turned every question back on me was just marriage getting hard, not marriage dying. She had become an expert at making me feel unstable. If I asked why she smiled at her phone and hid the screen, she would sigh and say, "You always do this when I'm finally in a decent mood." If I asked why she suddenly cared so much about going out alone, she would laugh like I was embarrassing myself and say, "Not everything is about cheating, Ryan. Maybe I just need space from your constant suspicion." She said that word, suspicion, like I was sick, like I was inventing things, and after hearing it enough, I started wondering if I was. When Tyler got back in the truck, I held up the earring and tried to watch his face before he could arrange it, but he barely even flinched. He just looked at it, then at me, then gave this crooked little shrug and said, "Man, your wife was helping me pick out a birthday gift for you last week. Don't start acting crazy too." That should have calmed me down, but it did the opposite because he said it too fast, too smooth, like they had rehearsed the line. I called her right there, and the second she answered, I said, "Take a picture with Megan right now." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to make my skin go cold. Then she snapped, "You are unbelievable. I am not doing this with you in public. You need help." I asked one more time, and when she lowered her voice and said, "Maybe if you were easier to live with, I wouldn't have to lie just to breathe." Something inside me cracked because that was not a denial. Then Tyler quietly reached for the earring in my hand and said, "Bro, let's not make this worse." And that was the exact second I noticed my wife's name lighting up on his truck screen from a text that read, "Did he see it?" That text stayed on the screen for maybe 2 seconds, but it burned into my brain so deeply I can still see it when I close my eyes. Because it wasn't just proof. It was coordination, it was planning, it was them being on the same side while I stood there like an outsider in my own life. And I remember looking from the screen to Tyler and saying, "Why is my wife asking you if I saw something?" And he didn't answer right away, which told me everything before he even opened his mouth. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You're reading into it, man. She probably meant—" And I cut him off because I could feel my voice shaking in a way I hated, and I said, "Don't lie to me again. Not right now. Not when I'm standing here holding her earring out of your truck." And for a second I thought he might actually tell the truth, but instead he leaned back like I was the problem and said, "You've been paranoid for months. Maybe she talks to me because you don't listen anymore." I called her again, right there in the passenger seat, and this time when she answered I didn't even try to sound calm. I just said, "Why are you texting Tyler asking if I saw something?" And she went completely silent, not defensive, not angry, just quiet in a way that felt calculated. And then she let out this slow breath and said, "Are you seriously going through his phone now too? Do you hear yourself?" And I remember gripping the dashboard so hard my hand started to hurt because she was doing it again, flipping it, twisting it, making me sound like I was the one crossing lines. I said, "I saw it on the screen, Erica. Your name popped up. Your message popped up. Don't do that." And she snapped back immediately. "Then maybe you should stop hovering around people like some kind of detective. It's embarrassing." And I swear there was this edge in her voice. Like she was annoyed I caught a detail, not scared I found the truth. I asked her one simple question after that, and I tried to keep my voice steady even though everything in me was coming apart. I said, "Were you in his truck?" And she laughed, actually laughed, like it was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard, and said, "Oh my God, I've been in his truck before. We're friends, remember? You introduced us." And that hit me harder than anything because she was right. I had trusted him. I had trusted them both. And now she was using that trust like a shield. I told her about the earring, and there was another pause, longer this time. And then she said, "I must have dropped it last week when we were all out. You're acting like you caught me in something when you're just connecting random dots." And the way she said random dots made me feel small, like I was piecing together nonsense instead of my own life. Tyler finally spoke again, softer this time, like he was trying to calm a situation he helped create. And he said, "Look, man, you're spiraling. Just go home. Talk to her like adults." But I couldn't stop staring at the screen because another message came through from her, and this one didn't even try to hide anything. It just said, "Call me when he leaves." And I felt something inside me go completely still, like all the noise shut off at once, because that wasn't a misunderstanding. That wasn't stress. That wasn't me being paranoid. That was timing. That was secrecy. That was them waiting for me to be out of the way. And I slowly turned to him and said, "How long?" When I said, "How long?" it didn't come out angry like I expected. It came out quiet, almost empty, like something inside me had already accepted an answer I didn't want to hear. And Tyler just stared at me for a second before looking away, like the ground suddenly became more interesting than my face. He let out this slow breath and said, "It's not what you think." And I actually laughed under my breath because that sentence felt so rehearsed it almost made me sick. And I leaned closer to him and said, "Then tell me what I think, Tyler. Because right now it looks like my wife is texting you to avoid me while her earring is sitting in your truck." He shook his head like I was being unreasonable and said, "You're twisting everything, man. She's been talking to me because she's stressed, because you've been on edge, and yeah, maybe we've been hanging out more, but that doesn't mean—" And I cut him off again, louder this time, because I could feel that pressure building in my chest. Hanging out more. "Since when do you hang out with my wife without me?" Before he could answer, my phone buzzed again, and it was her calling this time. Not texting, not avoiding, calling. And for a second I hesitated because something told me this was going to change everything depending on what she said next. I answered, put it on speaker without telling her and said, "I'm here, say it." Her voice came in softer than before, controlled, almost careful. And she said, "Ryan, you're blowing this up into something it's not. You're scaring me." And that word, scaring, hit me wrong because I wasn't yelling anymore. I wasn't even moving. I was just sitting there trying to understand how my life had turned into this conversation. I said, "Then explain the messages." And she didn't answer directly. She shifted, like she always did, and said, "I texted him because I knew you'd react exactly like this if you saw anything out of context. I was trying to avoid a scene." And I looked straight at Tyler when she said that, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked her again, slower this time, "How long have you been seeing him without me?" And there was that pause again. That same measured silence, like she was choosing the version of the truth she could get away with. And then she said, "We're friends, Ryan. We talk. We meet sometimes. That's it. You're the one making it ugly." And I felt my jaw tighten because she kept using that word, ugly. Like the problem wasn't what she was doing, but how I was reacting to it. Tyler finally spoke up, almost defensive now, saying, "I told you, it's nothing like that." But the timing of it felt off, like he was trying to support her story instead of telling his own. And that's when something clicked in a way I wish it hadn't. I said, "Put Megan on the phone." And this time she didn't even try to pretend. She just exhaled sharply and said, "She's in the bathroom." And I closed my eyes for a second because that was the first crack. The first thing that didn't even try to hold up under pressure. And when I opened them again, I said, "Then walk to her." And she snapped, fast and cold, "I'm not doing this. You don't get to interrogate me like I'm some criminal." And I said, "No, I get to ask my wife why she's lying to me." And there was this silence that followed. heavy, suffocating, like both of them were waiting for the other to fix it. And then Tyler's phone buzzed again, and this time I didn't even look at him. I just looked straight at the screen as her message came through, and it said, "Just say we're planning his birthday." And I felt something in me break in a way that wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, final, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. And I looked at him one last time and said, "So that's the story you two came up with?" For a second, nobody said anything, and that silence felt louder than any argument we had ever had, because it wasn't confusion anymore. It was exposure. It was the moment where the story they built started collapsing in front of me, and neither of them knew how to hold it together. Tyler finally swallowed and said, "It's not like that," again. But this time his voice didn't carry the same confidence, and I shook my head slowly because I was done hearing that sentence. It didn't mean anything anymore. I looked at the phone, then at him, and said, "You don't get to say that after I just watched you coordinate lies with my wife in real time." And he shifted in his seat like he wanted to get out of the truck but didn't know how without making it worse. She was still on the call, still listening, and I could hear her breathing now, quicker than before, and I said, "Go ahead, Erica. Explain the birthday plan. I'd love to hear how my earring ends up in his truck as part of that." And she snapped back immediately, "It's not your earring. Stop saying it like that." And I felt my chest tighten because that was new. That was a different angle. Not denying the situation, just denying ownership of the evidence. I said, "So now it's not yours?" And she said, "I have earrings that look like that. It doesn't mean anything." And I laughed. But there was nothing funny about it. It just came out because I didn't know what else to do with the way she was rewriting reality right in front of me. Tyler finally tried a different approach, softer, almost pleading, saying, "Man, you're taking everything to the worst possible conclusion. She's just been talking to me because things between you two have been rough." And I turned to him and said, "So you step in? That's your solution? You get closer to my wife behind my back?" And he raised his hand slightly like he was trying to calm me down and said, "I was trying to help." And that word, help, hit something deep in me because it felt like such a betrayal wrapped in something that sounded reasonable. I asked her one more time, slower than before, like I was giving her a chance to stop all of this from getting worse. "Have you been seeing him without telling me?" And there was a long pause, longer than any before. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was cold, almost tired, like she had decided something, and she said, "I've been seeing him, yes, but not the way you're thinking." And everything in me went still again because that wasn't denial. That was admission dressed in ambiguity. I felt my throat tighten as I said, "Then what way?" And she answered immediately this time, like she had been waiting for that question. The way someone talks to a person who actually listens. The way someone spends time with a person who doesn't make them feel small all the time. And I closed my eyes for a second because she wasn't just explaining anymore. She was turning it into my fault, into my failure, into the reason this was happening at all. Tyler didn't say anything this time. He just stared forward, and that silence from him felt louder than anything she was saying. Then she added something that I wasn't ready for, something that shifted everything in a way that made my hands start shaking again. And she said, "If you hadn't started digging, we could have figured this out without you blowing everything up." And I opened my eyes and said, "Figured what out?" And she didn't hesitate. Not even for a second. She just said, "How to tell you without destroying you." And I felt something inside me drop because that meant there was more, a lot more. And I looked at Tyler again, really looked at him this time, and said, "What exactly were you two planning to tell me?" The second I asked that, I saw it in Tyler's face before he even said a word. That flicker of panic, that split-second hesitation where the truth tries to come out but gets shoved back down. And I knew whatever they were about to admit was worse than anything I had already imagined. He ran a hand over his face and said, "Man, this isn't something we wanted you to find out like this." And I felt my chest tighten because that wasn't denial. That was preparation. That was him trying to soften something that was already sharp enough to cut me in half. I leaned back in the seat, suddenly exhausted in a way I can't explain, and said, "Then just say it. Because whatever version you're trying to control right now, I'm already past it." She didn't wait for him this time. She jumped in, her voice steady but colder than I had ever heard it, and said, "We were going to tell you that things between us haven't been working for a long time." And I almost laughed again because of how clinical it sounded, like she was reading from a script, like 11 years could be reduced to a line she practiced in her head. I said, "That's not new, Erica. Try again." And there was a brief pause before she continued, "And that I've been leaning on Tyler more than I should have." And I looked at him when she said his name, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked, "Leaning how?" And she hesitated just long enough to make it worse before saying, "Emotionally." And I shook my head slowly because even now she was trying to control the damage, trying to give me the smallest version of the truth that could still pass if I let it. I said, "You expect me to believe that's all this is?" And she snapped back, irritation breaking through again. "You expect me to explain anything when you're already convinced I'm the villain?" And that word, villain, hit me hard, because it told me she had already rewritten the story in her head where she was justified and I was the reason she crossed every line. Tyler finally spoke again, quieter this time, like he knew he was losing control of it, and said, "We didn't plan this. It just happened." And that sentence made something in me flare because it sounded so familiar, like every excuse I had ever heard from people who got caught doing exactly what they weren't supposed to do. I turned to him and said, "Nothing just happens like this. You don't accidentally start hiding things from me. You don't accidentally text each other about what I see." And he didn't argue. He just looked down, and that silence felt like confirmation. Then she said something that I wasn't ready for, something that shifted it from suspicion to something heavier, something final. And her voice dropped lower as she said, "We were going to tell you after this weekend." And I felt my stomach twist, because now there was a timeline, now there was planning, now there was something already set in motion. I said, "Tell me what exactly." And this time she didn't dodge it, she didn't soften it, she just said, "That I'm leaving." And everything in me went completely still again because I hadn't even been given the chance to process what was already happening, and she was already talking about the end like it was decided. I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady, "Leaving to go where?" And there was this brief silence on the line, like she was weighing how much to reveal. And then she said it. Simple, direct, like it didn't carry the weight it should have. With him. And I turned slowly to Tyler, searching his face for anything, denial, regret, something. But all I saw was guilt and something else underneath it. Something that looked a lot like acceptance. And that's when I realized this wasn't something they were figuring out anymore. It was something they had already agreed on. But before I could even react, before I could process what that actually meant, she added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, like it wasn't the kind of detail that would destroy me all over again. And she said, "And there's something else you need to know before you start acting like this is just about him." And I felt my grip tighten on the phone as I said, "What else?" There was something in the way she said that, something almost detached, like she had already rehearsed this moment in her head, and I was just finally catching up to a conversation she'd been having without me for weeks, maybe months. And I felt this pressure building behind my eyes as I said, "What else?" Because I wasn't sure I even wanted to hear it anymore, but I also knew I wouldn't be able to stop until I did. She didn't answer right away, and that pause felt heavier than any of the others, like this was the part she knew would land the hardest. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost careful, and she said, "This didn't start with him the way you think it did." I frowned, trying to process that, and said, "What does that even mean?" And she exhaled slowly before answering, "It means you're focusing on the wrong person." And I felt my stomach twist, because now it wasn't just about Tyler anymore. Now she was widening it, making it something bigger, something I hadn't even considered yet. I glanced at him, expecting confusion, denial, anything. But he still wouldn't look at me, and that made it worse because it felt like he already knew where this was going. I said, "Then who?" And there was another pause, shorter this time, like she had already decided she was going to say it, and she said, "You remember when I started staying late at work a few months ago?" And I felt my jaw tighten because I did remember. I remembered asking about it. I remembered her telling me I was overthinking it, that her team was under pressure, that I needed to stop making everything into a problem. I said, "Yeah, I remember." And she continued, "That's when things started changing for me." And I cut in immediately. "Changing how?" And she said, "Changing how I felt about everything. About us." I shook my head, trying to stay grounded, trying not to let her steer this into something vague again. And I said, "No, don't do that. Don't generalize it. Tell me what actually happened." And she went quiet for a second before finally saying, "There was someone else before Tyler." And the words hit me in a way I didn't expect, because I had been so focused on the betrayal sitting right next to me that I hadn't even considered there was another layer underneath it. I turned slowly toward Tyler, searching his face again, and this time he finally spoke, low and tense. "I didn't know about that at first." And that sentence made everything shift again, because now it wasn't just betrayal. It was layers of it, timelines I didn't understand, things happening behind my back long before I even started questioning anything. I said into the phone, my voice tight, "Who was it?" And she didn't hesitate this time. She just said, "Someone from work. It didn't last. It wasn't serious." And I let out a hollow breath because that word, "not serious," felt like a knife. Like she was minimizing something that had already broken everything without me even knowing it existed. I asked, "Does Tyler know everything?" And she answered, "He knows enough." And I looked at him again, really looked this time, and saw the guilt deepen in a way that told me there was more he wasn't saying, more he was holding back. And that made my chest feel tight again, because I realized I wasn't just being lied to by one person, I was being managed by two. Then she said something that made everything feel even more calculated, more intentional than I was ready for. And her voice hardened slightly as she added, "You need to understand, Ryan. I didn't wake up one day and decide to do this to you. You pushed me here over time." And I felt that familiar anger rise again, because even now, even after everything she had just admitted, she was still trying to make me part of the cause, still trying to rewrite the story, so she didn't have to carry all of it. I said, "So this is my fault now?" And she replied immediately, "I didn't say that, but you're not innocent in this either." And I closed my eyes for a second, because I could feel myself slipping into that same confusion she had been creating for months. That same loop where I questioned my own reality instead of hers. But then Tyler said something under his breath, something he clearly didn't mean for me to catch, and it cut through everything else like a blade. He muttered, "That's not what you told me." And my eyes snapped open as I turned toward him and said, "What did she tell you?" The second he said that, everything else faded out. Her voice on the phone, the hum of the engine, even my own breathing. Because that one sentence meant there were two versions of the truth floating around, and neither of them belonged to me. I turned fully toward him, my voice low but sharp, and said, "What did she tell you?" And he froze for a second, like he was trying to decide which lie to commit to. But this time it wasn't as easy for him, because I was watching him too closely, and he knew it. He glanced at the phone, like he was checking if she could hear him clearly, and then said, "She told me things were already over between you two, that you were just living together because it was easier than dealing with it." I felt something twist hard in my chest, because that wasn't just betrayal. That was erasure. That was her rewriting our entire marriage to make room for what she was doing. And I brought the phone closer and said, "Is that what you've been telling people? That we're already over?" And she didn't answer right away, which told me more than anything she could have said. Then she sighed, like she was tired of the conversation instead of responsible for it, and said, "I told him the truth as I experienced it." And I almost laughed again, because that phrase, "as I experienced it," felt like the cleanest way to lie without technically lying. I said, "So in your version, I just don't exist anymore? I'm just the guy you're waiting to leave?" And she snapped back, a little sharper now, "Don't twist it like that. You know things haven't been good between us." And I said, "Not good doesn't mean over, Erica. Not good doesn't mean you get to build something with someone else behind my back." And for the first time, she didn't immediately push back. She just went quiet. And that silence felt heavier than anything she had said so far. Tyler shifted beside me, clearly uncomfortable now, and said, "She told me you checked out a long time ago, man, that you didn't even notice her anymore." And I turned to him slowly and said, "And you just believed that? You didn't think to ask me?" And he shook his head slightly, almost defensive again. I wasn't trying to get involved like that. She came to me. She needed someone. And I cut him off, my voice rising despite myself. "So you became that someone? You stepped into my place without even hearing my side?" And he didn't answer. He just looked down again. And that silence said enough. On the phone, she let out a breath and said, "This is exactly why I didn't want it to happen like this." And that sentence hit me wrong, because it wasn't regret about what she did. It was regret about getting caught, about losing control of how it unfolded. I said, "No, this is exactly what happens when you lie long enough. It stops being something you can manage." And she replied, colder now. I wasn't managing it. I was trying to survive it. And I felt my jaw tighten because even now she was framing herself as the one trapped, the one suffering, like I was just a condition she had to endure. I leaned back, staring at the windshield but not really seeing anything, and said quietly, "So let me get this straight. You were with someone at work, then you started something with my best friend, all while telling him we were basically over, and somehow I'm the one who pushed you into this?" And she didn't respond immediately. And that pause felt like the closest thing to honesty I had gotten all night. Then Tyler said something that made everything drop even further, something that made my hands go cold on the spot. He said, "She didn't tell me about the work guy until last week, but she said there was a reason she never told you about him at all." And I turned my head slowly toward the phone as my heart started pounding again, harder this time. And I said, "What reason?" When I asked, "What reason?" My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded distant, like I was listening to someone else's life falling apart from the outside. And there was this long silence on the line, longer than anything before, like she was finally standing at a point she couldn't twist or soften without everything collapsing completely. I could hear her breathing again, uneven now. And for the first time that night, it didn't sound controlled. It sounded real, like whatever she was about to say was something she hadn't planned to give up this way. Tyler shifted beside me, clearly regretting that he had said anything at all, and muttered, "Man, maybe we should just..." But I cut him off without even looking at him. "No, we're not stopping now." And I brought the phone closer, my hand tightening around it as I said again, slower this time, "What reason, Erica?" And she finally answered, her voice lower, stripped of that sharp edge she had been using all night. And she said, "Because I wasn't sure it was just a mistake." That sentence didn't land all at once. It sank in piece by piece, like my brain was trying to delay the impact, and I felt my chest tighten as I said, "What does that mean?" And she hesitated again. But this time it wasn't calculation. It was hesitation, like she knew this was the point where everything would change permanently. Then she said it, quietly but clearly enough that there was no room to misunderstand. "It means I didn't know who I was going to choose." I felt the air leave my lungs in a way that actually made me lean forward, like something physical had hit me, and for a second I couldn't even respond, because that wasn't just betrayal, that was evaluation. That was her weighing me against other people like I was an option, like 11 years could be compared and replaced if something else felt better. I finally managed to say, "So you were just trying people out?" And she immediately snapped back, defensive again now that it was out. "Don't say it like that. You're making it sound cheap." And I laughed, but it came out broken, because I didn't know how else to react to that. Tyler spoke up again, quieter now, like he was realizing the full weight of what he had stepped into. "She told me she was confused, that she didn't feel the same about you anymore." And I turned to him slowly and said, "And you thought the right move was to step in while she figured that out?" And he didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that didn't make him look exactly like what he was. On the phone, she said my name, softer this time, almost like she was trying to reach back to something that didn't exist anymore. "Ryan, It wasn't supposed to get like this. And I closed my eyes for a second because that sentence felt so empty compared to everything she had just admitted. I said, "It didn't get like this. You made it like this." And there was no anger in my voice anymore, just this heavy, hollow certainty that whatever we had was already gone. I just hadn't known it until tonight. I opened my eyes and looked straight ahead. Not at Tyler, not at the phone, just forward, and said quietly, "So when were you going to decide?" And she didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything I needed to know, because it meant she hadn't decided yet. Not fully, not until this moment forced it out into the open. And that's when I realized something that hurt more than anything else she had said all night. Something that made everything feel even smaller than it already did. And I said, barely above a whisper, "You weren't choosing between us. You were waiting to see who was easier to leave."